Welcome, everyone. This is the workshop on scrying, and we're also going to talk about muscle testing and pendulum scrying, which is slightly different from this type of scrying. It is one of the topics that I get asked about the most. This is actually one of the topics that, in preparing for a larger, I was preparing for this workshop, and it just is such a huge topic that it was one of the main reasons that I thought I need to stop doing 2 workshops a month and start doing bigger workshops. And it was the catalyst for the big changes on Patreon. So if you haven't seen that yet, we're not doing 2 workshops a month anymore, and we're going to have bigger, longer, more involved ones. Because like with a topic like scrying, there's so much. There's so much. And it might not be necessary to know, everything about scrying in order to scry effectively. However, not every type of scrying will work or will feel comfortable to everyone. And so it's one of those things where if you were to teach a class about crystals per se, but you only ever had enough time to talk about rose quartz, amethyst, and red jasper, you might get to the point where you're like, oh, crystals don't really do it for me, right? And so in that same way, scrying is very similar. There are so many different ways to scry, so many different mediums, so many different processes that work for some people and don't work for other people. And then there's kind of a whole area that is left to the wayside if you don't immediately have an experience with it, because you don't really know what you don't know. And so scrying would typically be taught. I was taught to scry when I was younger, actually by not my family, by a friend who had a black obsidian scrying mirror. And like that, like funny story about how teenage girls are like super into witchcraft instinctively, learned at like a sleepover. And so it's just a funny topic that I happen to have a lot of random information about. And so I tried to distill it down as much as I could for an intro, but this would be something that we could do a much bigger workshop on. It's so much more involved than it ever seems to be. I think this is a scrying pool from a video game. I was laughing that I decided to use it, but I tend to find that pools of water, I'm a very heavily water element person. I tend to scry a lot in water just as a standard. So once you learn the process of scrying, you can scry anywhere. And I always say you can scry in your own mind once you learn the technique. I think that just like everything else in the occult, the tools are just kind of the tools, and you're the main thing that's doing the work. The tools can help you learn. The tools can give you a bypass sometimes. I know for me, like when we get to the end and we talk about muscle testing is a way that I back up my intuition or like check my work. Same thing with pendulum energy, and same thing with my dowsing rods. I tend to use them as a check back of my work, not necessarily the initial thing that I come over. And I use those sometimes if I'm feeling like, is this an intuitive leading or is this my mind? And I will use my scrying pendulum, or I'll use my dowsing rods or something like that. So it's not always the first thing that I tend to anymore. The whole system of scrying can be kind of umbrellaed. There's different kinds of scrying. The lecanomancy, or however the different types of people say it, is the system of divination in which you scry. And then for each different kind of scry tool, there's a different mancy, right? So you would have to look up those things individually. But typically, dating way back to Babylonia, ancient Egypt, the ancient cultures all had some form of scrying in their divination and their spiritual work. But typically this whole umbrella term is just using a basin or a bowl or a vase or a cup of water. And sometimes, depending on how the seer learn to do it, you either drop rocks in it, you can drip oil in it, you can drip ink in it, you can swirl the water and then watch the way the water works, or you let it go completely still and use it like a mirror, or a looking glass. And the main thing that we're doing when we're scrying is a form of self or auto hypnosis, right? Kind of like the magic eye paintings where it looks like just a bunch of nothing, but then the longer and longer that you look into it and the more you let your mind settle, the image kind of pops out and looks 3D. It's very similar to that. Depending on who you learn it from, what you learn it from, you'll learn different things. Some people believe that you're actually contacting the other world. Some people believe that you're contacting hell. Some people believe that you're contacting angels or helpful spirits. Some people think you're just going into your subconscious, right? Like Carl Jung. And if you read about how shadow work comes up under Carl Jung's theories, like mirror gazing and things like that, he uses them to access your subconscious, the things that are actually happening. Even if that's the case, a lot of clairvoyance will say that your subconscious always knows. Your subconscious can't be separated from, universal consciousness. Um, that your subconscious and conscious cannot ever be separated from other humans, the interconnectedness of humanity. And so your inner knowing and your intuition are that connection. And so when you go into this auto hypnosis or you go into this space, you're actually cutting down your ego and putting your ego aside so that you can tap into that interconnectedness and that inner knowing and the universal intelligence and things like that. So it just depends on what system you use or who you learn from or what books you read, but everybody has sort of a different opinion. But historically, it goes back even with things that seem like something else. Scrying is kind of at the source of it. So like rune casting or bone casting, or there are some cultures that have trinket casting where a person collects things that they find, and like, just when you're out living your life, you might find something on the side of the road or on the sidewalks, or sometimes things are given to you and they're little trinkets and they keep them in a bag and then they shake them and toss them and then they read the items. It's an old granny folk magic type of scrying, but it's all basically the same thing where you might even tarot reading can be a form of scrying if you're doing the act of scrying when you're reading tarot. And so it's something that I do. I scry with astrology charts. And I think I've said that before on a couple of calls that I look at a birth chart and then I explain it when I'm talking about astrology, where I look at the birth chart and things just pop out at me, but it's not just that they pop out. It's that I go into that space and basically scry over the birth charts. So it's a technique, and it is not dependent on the tool. Sometimes you will have different visions with different tools. John Dee and Edward Kelly used astrology and Enochian scrying. And if you get into Enochian scrying, it's a whole different, this is one of the things where this could be like a 3-hour workshop. That type of scrying is very mathematic and very particular, and there's all sorts of rules, or maybe not even rules, but tradition, and there are steps, and there's like a whole ritualistic magic type, ceremonial magic to the Enochian scrying. But Kelly used a crystal orb, and that's well documented throughout history, and it's often where a lot of people that study occult practices like this refer back to John Dee and Edward Kelly for a lot of these kind of things that are very mystical. And so it can be very interesting what you see on the left, right? It's depicted often scrying using a pool of water, but it's very different in real life. So I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone in my personal life that feels like the scrying object turns into like a TV screen, except for if you have that standard. So when and if you've done Reiki with me, when we talk about the mental room, I'm a highly visual person. So when I'm meditating, when I'm in my mental room doing long distance Reiki, when I'm having visions, I'm hyper visual. So I can close my eyes and I can project a screen. I could watch a movie. It's something that we joke about. I'm never bored because I'm so visual. I can close my eyes and do anything. Um, and so if you have that kind of gift of the visual, then you may see things in the actual crystal ball. You may see things in the mirror. Oftentimes, it's like a lack of sensory that allows you to auto hypnosis and then project what you're feeling on the inside. So you don't ever usually see things quite as dramatic as it is in sci-fi, which I feel like even with psychic abilities and mediumship, that's really hyped up in Hollywood. And um, people always tend to feel like, oh, I can't do that. I can't see that. I don't get those feelings, but it's because it's not actually what you think it's going to be. So different scrying that's currently used that you can get into for relatively cheap. There's ink, smoke, water, crystals. Oh, the other half of that's missing. Obsidian, clear quartz are the two top. But there's also fake obsidian glass crystal balls that are black. Anything that's black is going to work a little bit better when it comes to the self-hypnosis part. But I certainly know and have talked about before that you can scry into any crystal and it doesn't have to be an orb. And oftentimes, like Lemurian seed crystal points will be something that people will scry into. Also, black mirrors. And if you can't get an obsidian black mirror, there are different DIY things that you can turn your own mirrors into a black mirror. But it's something that's important to just keep reminding yourself that the tool doesn't necessarily matter. What matters the most is that you feel extremely comfortable doing it. And it's something that you find soothing, relaxing, and de-stimulating. So you want to stimulate the ego as little as possible, kind of like the float tanks and the sensory deprivation tanks. When I go into the float tanks, it's a total scrying type of situation. My visions are wildly intense. The amount of visions that I get in a float tank is wild because all sensory experiences are totally gone. You're floating, it's dark, you're warm, the water's like body temperature. And so all of the stuff that's normally coming at you that you have to filter away is gone. And so that energy, the same thing with scrying comes naturally to the surface. And so if you feel like you can't scry, if you go and do like a sensory chamber or a float tank or something, it usually you're like, oh, okay, I can do it. I just need way less stimulation. It's best to do in a darkened room, to light a candle. If you're using an actual mirror, you want to wear black clothing. And if you are like pale, like I am, I will oftentimes sit a little further back from the mirror because I'm so pale that I seem to reflect light even in a dark room. Or you can put a black shawl over you, just over your clothing so that you don't see a bunch of reflection. You want to get as little stimulation as you can. You want to sit closer to the scry, under 2 feet. I like to generally sit closer, like less than a foot. I sit rather close because I'm trying to allow myself to just my consciousness, my ego, to everything to wash away and to become absorbed by the item. And so then you kind of just relax into the gaze, similar to those magic eye images. One of the things that you'll see in historical documents where they're talking about scrying, Andrew Lang is an author that wrote a lot about the ancient uses of scrying and talked to a lot of people who use scrying. And so he's got a lot of documentation because he was unable to kind of do it himself. I don't know if anyone knows who Andrew Lang is. There's a lot more about that. But one of the things that he used to write about is that it seemed like when talking to people who scry frequently and who use that as their main divination technique, that they seem to almost feel as if your consciousness needs to go through the portal of some sort. So there's a lot of ancient tradition where it's not considered self-hypnosis. It's getting to a place where you can, drop your consciousness and your ego enough that your astral form then would like go into this item. And so depending on the tradition and who you learn from, that's also a possibility. These are the symbols that sometimes come up. I use this as more of a reminder than an instruction guide. So like when you're reading tea leaves, it's what is Aleister Crowley says something about not wanting to teach anybody anything too specific when it comes to like ceremonial things. And he wants people to carve their way through the jungle themselves. And that's often what it feels like when you're teaching things like reading tea leaves or scrying, pendulum usage, dowsing rods, things like that. Even as a young child, like when I was learning to read tea leaves, the women in my family wouldn't be like, oh, do you see this right here? That means this. Or, oh, do you see this over here? This means that. They would always say, well, what do you see? What do you think you see? What do you think that means? Right? They would always be asking me to dig into, because it's the communication with me and it's my subconscious. And so they would want to know. And then they might say, okay, do you see, I see this here, or maybe this could mean this, or did you see this arrow over here? And it would be something like that. And it's the same thing with scrying. The only reason I bring up symbols is that oftentimes if you do happen to contact an angel or a spirit or one of your ancestors or any sort of guide, or the fae, depending on what crystal you're using or what medium you're using, I get really I use words that other people make other people uncomfortable, but I often feel like when I water scry, I feel like I connect to some sort of a water nymph type energy that's consistent anywhere. And my brain uses, when I'm scrying into water, I'm making a connection with the water to other water in the world. And so it's a whole different, again, this could be like hours long, but one of the big things is that sometimes symbols will come up that you've never seen before. And it happens in Reiki too. I'll tune somebody and they'll say, I saw the symbol and I've never seen it. And they'll try to describe it and I've never seen it. And then they'll look up online different like things to try to find the symbol. And then they find it and it's very specific and it's very exact. And it's something that they couldn't have created because they didn't know about it. And so if you see symbols or you're looking and you're like, that looks just like such and such, you write that down and you look it up and you explore it more, because sometimes you are being communicated with and it's not just your subconscious. So it's something that you wouldn't normally have access to. So just a reminder that there could be actual symbols coming up. And that you always want to think back to what could this symbol mean for me and who could be communicating that. So it just depends on what you're looking for. These are just some images, this slide and the next slide, of different things people use to scry and different ways they scry. I have known somebody who did this with their tarot cards. They kept a scry mirror. This is obsidian. But they had a scry mirror and they would light a candle and they would pass certain tarot cards in front and they would get different visions based on what was reflected to their subconscious, right, as they were passing them in front of. The scry table on the right can be used to scry into just as is, or things can be cast over the table. There are scry mats that a lot of people will use, and you can just use stones on a mat. There are so many endless ways to scry. These are some of the more modern ways that you might find. The one in the middle is not modern, it is an antique. But it just goes to show that people have been scrying for a very long time, and anything you feel a connection to is important, whether it's an actual black mirror, whether it's an actual obsidian, regardless, what matters most is that you connect to it and you feel like you could get lost into it. And it's always interesting, right? One of my favorite quotes by Nietzsche is, be careful when you stare into the abyss because the abyss stares back. And I always feel like that's one warning whenever you're scrying, right, is to make sure you're doing your boundaries and make sure that you are feeling super protected and that, you are not doing the scrying when you're in an altered state of mind. Like I don't scry if I'm altered in any way. I don't um makes me sound like such like an innocent person to say I don't do drugs. I don't do hallucinogens. I don't smoke pot or anything like that. So I'm never altered in that way. But like I wouldn't drink a glass of wine and then scry. Right. I feel like you have to be really careful with your boundaries and you want to have all of your senses on alert. Um, there have been times where we've been at thrift stores and stuff, and I'll see a black mirror. I'm like, oh, that is so cool. And then the closer I get to it, I'm like, that is not for me. Somebody used that for something else, and I'm not interested in the process of cleansing it or whatever. And so you want to have your instincts and your senses really activated. So I'm going to pause the recording